I stared at my father across the mahogany table, watching him sign away what remained of my mother's dignity. His hand moved with practiced ease, the same hand that had once stroked her hair while she slept, the same hand that had dialed his mistress while my mother's body grew cold in the hospital bed 3 floors below. "Emily, you understand this is what's best," he said, not looking up from the papers. I said nothing. I had learned, finally, that silence held more power than any scream. The funeral was in 2 days. The flowers were already ordered, white lilies, my mother's favourite, though he wouldn't remember that. His assistant had handled it, the same assistant who had booked his hotel rooms, who had transferred money to accounts I wasn't supposed to know about, who had scheduled his absences with the precision of a military operation. I signed where he pointed. My hand didn't shake. That surprised him. I saw it in the slight pause of his pen, the way his eyes flicked toward me and then quickly away. He expected tears, rage, the same emotional storms that had defined my teenage years, when I had screamed and broken things and made myself small with my own fury. But I had stopped being that girl exactly 47 days ago when I walked into my mother's hospital room and found it empty except for a nurse changing sheets. My father had been there. He had been with her, and then he wasn't. His phone, left carelessly on the visitor's chair, had buzzed with a message. "Thank you for coming. I needed you." The timestamp, 3:47 p.m. My mother's time of death, 3:52 p.m. 5 minutes. He had given her 5 minutes alone at the end, because someone else needed him more. I was 7 when I first understood that my mother was disappearing. Not dying, not yet, but fading in the way that people do when they stop believing they deserve to be seen. My father had brought home a new colleague, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper smile, and I watched my mother's spine curve just slightly, her shoulders drawing inward like a flower closing against frost. "This is Victoria," my father said, and there was something in his voice I had never heard before, a brightness, an attention, an aliveness that I suddenly realised had been missing when he spoke to us. My mother made dinner. Victoria praised it. My father laughed at Victoria's jokes. My mother cleared the plates in silence. I was too young then to name what I was seeing, but old enough to feel its weight. That night I heard my mother crying in the bathroom, the water running to cover the sound. I had stood outside the door, my small hand pressed against the wood, wanting to help but not knowing how. The pattern continued for years. Victoria became a fixture in our lives. At company dinners, at holiday parties, always beside my father, while my mother photographed the moments she was no longer part of. My mother never confronted him. She had been raised to believe that a good wife swallowed her pain, that love meant sacrifice, that her worth was measured in how little space she took up. She made herself smaller and smaller until there was almost nothing left. When I was 15, she was diagnosed. Stage 3, they said, and my father cried at the hospital, his face buried in his hands. I watched him, this man who could summon tears on command, and felt something cold settle in my chest. He drove us home in silence, and that evening I saw him step outside to take a call. Through the window, I watched him smile. The treatments began: chemotherapy, radiation, surgeries that carved away pieces of her until she was a ghost of herself. My father was attentive. He drove her to appointments, held her hand during difficult news, posted updates on social media about their journey together. People called him devoted, a model husband, so sure, strong for his family. But I saw the calls he took in the hallway. I saw the weekends he claimed to be travelling for work. I saw the credit card statements that arrived, which he thought he had hidden, showing purchases in cities where his company had no offices. I tracked every lie, every absence, every moment he chose her over us. My mother never said anything. She had accepted, I think, that this was her fate, to be betrayed even as she died, to be second even in her own tragedy. She would touch my hair sometimes, late at night when the pain kept her awake, and whisper, "You're stronger than me, Emily. You'll be stronger than me." I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. I had never been what I appeared to be. The grieving daughter, the emotional teenager, the girl who screamed at her father and slammed doors. That was real, but it was also a shell. Beneath it, I was always watching, always remembering, always filing away each betrayal with the cold precision of someone who knew, even then, that there would come a time for accounting. I started keeping records when I was 16. A simple notebook at first, hidden in the lining of my winter coat, where my father would never think to look. Dates, times, phone numbers glimpsed on his screen, names mentioned in conversations he thought I wasn't listening to, the name of the hotel where he stayed during my mother's surgery, the same hotel where Victoria had posted a photo of her breakfast view. As I grew older, I became more sophisticated. I learned to recover deleted text messages from the family computer. I found the bank statements he kept in his office, photographing them with my phone before, carefully replacing them exactly as they had been. I discovered the second phone, the one he kept in his car, and I learned its password by watching his fingers in the reflection of the rearview mirror. While my mother weakened, while my father performed his role as the devoted husband, while Victoria waited in the wings for her moment, I built my case, transaction by transaction, lie by lie. I collected evidence of financial infidelity, of funds diverted from my mother's care, of money spent on a woman who was not his wife, while his wife rationed her pain medication to save money. I said nothing. I played my part perfectly. The difficult daughter, the one who caused problems, the one whose anger could be dismissed as teenage rebellion. Let him think I was powerless. Let him think I was too emotional, too unstable, too foolish to be a threat. I learned programming. I learned accounting. I taught myself law, reading cases late into the night while my mother slept fitfully in the next room. I created encrypted backups of everything I found, stored in multiple locations he could never access. I opened a bank account he didn't know about, slowly saving money from the graduation gifts and part-time jobs he considered beneath notice. While they thought I was falling apart, I was building myself into something unbreakable. My mother died believing I was lost. A girl too angry to think clearly, too hurt to plan. She died never knowing that her daughter had been preparing for this moment since the night she stood outside a bathroom door, listening to hidden sobs. I let her believe I was weak. It was the kindest thing I could do for her, to let her go without the burden of knowing what I would become. The change wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment of transformation, no sudden switch from chaos to control. Instead, I simply stopped performing the role that no longer served me. I stopped crying where my father could see. I stopped arguing. I stopped slamming doors and making scenes. I became quiet, cooperative, exactly the daughter he had always wanted me to be. It unnerved him at first. I saw the confusion in his eyes, the way he watched me across the dinner table, as if I were a stranger. But grief, he decided, had finally matured me. He congratulated himself, I think, on my newfound composure. He didn't realize that my silence wasn't acceptance, it was calculation. I enrolled in business school, choosing a program my father approved of, at a university he considered prestigious. He paid the tuition with my mother's life insurance money that should have been mine, that he controlled through a trust he had established, naming himself as the sole trustee. I thanked him. I let him believe he was shaping my future, guiding me towards something respectable. While I studied corporate finance, I also studied him. I learned his patterns, his passwords, his vulnerabilities. I befriended his colleagues, presenting myself as the devoted daughter trying to understand her father's world. They talked freely around me, these men who thought young women were decorative and harmless. They told me about deals and mergers, about accounts and strategies, and about the ways money moved when you didn't want it traced. I learned everything I needed to dismantle him. I also befriended Victoria. This was perhaps my greatest performance. I called her 6 months after my mother's funeral, my voice soft and uncertain, asking if we could talk. She agreed, surprised but pleased. The grieving daughter, reaching out, finally ready to accept her father's happiness. We met for coffee. I cried, carefully calibrated tears that never quite fell. I told her I understood now that my mother had been sick for so long, that my father had been lonely, that love was complicated. She touched my hand, her eyes soft with sympathy and triumph. She thought she had won me over. I became a fixture in their lives. I had dinner with them. I asked Victoria about her work, her interests, her past. She talked freely, this woman who thought she had conquered all obstacles, who believed that my acceptance meant her victory was complete. She didn't notice how much she revealed. She didn't notice that I was memorizing every word, every inconsistency, every small crack in the story she told about herself. My father was relieved. His daughter and his love finally at peace. Finally a family, however unconventional. He started talking about the future, about bringing Victoria into the business, about marriage, about the life they would build now that the sad chapter of my mother was finally closed. I smiled. I asked thoughtful questions. I made suggestions that he thought were mine, but were really carefully placed seeds that would grow into his destruction. All the while, I continued my work. The evidence I had collected as a teenager was nothing compared to what I gathered now. Financial records, emails, text messages, photos. I documented every dollar he had diverted from my mother's care, every expense he had hidden, every lie he had told to insurance companies and lawyers, and the court that had granted him control of her affairs. I found things even I hadn't expected. Medical bills he had never paid, letting them go to collections rather than use the money he was spending on Victoria. Insurance claims he had denied, forging my mother's signature, claiming she didn't want aggressive treatment when she had begged for every possible chance. Medications he had cancelled, telling the doctors she had refused them, while she suffered alone in pain she thought she had to endure. He hadn't just betrayed her. He had hastened her death. And he had done it all while presenting himself as the devoted husband, the tragic hero of his own story. I catalogued it all. Every crime, every cruelty, every moment of negligence that had killed her as surely as the cancer had. And I waited for the right moment to strike. The event was his 60th birthday party, held at the country club, where he had once brought my mother on their anniversary, back when she still believed in happy endings. Victoria had planned everything: the guest list, the menu, the speeches that would celebrate his success and his generosity. She had invited his colleagues, his business partners, the reporters who covered his company, the board members who controlled his future. She had also invited me to speak. It would mean so much to him, she said, her hand on my arm, her smile warm. A daughter's tribute. A sign that we're truly family now. I agreed. I even helped her write the speech she imagined I would give, something about loss and healing, about how my father had taught me strength through his example, about how grateful I was for his love and guidance. She read it and cried, telling me it was perfect. I had no intention of delivering it. The night of the party, I wore white, the colour my mother had loved, the colour of the lilies we had placed on her grave. My father embraced me at the entrance, proud and pleased, his arm around Victoria as if she had always belonged there. Around us, people laughed and drank and celebrated a man they thought they knew. The speeches began. Colleagues praised his vision. Business partners toasted his success. Victoria spoke of love and second chances, her voice trembling with emotion that I knew now was as calculated as everything else about her. Then, it was my turn. I walked to the microphone with the papers Victoria had seen, the speech she expected. I set them down on the podium. I looked out at the room, at my father's face, expectant and confident, at Victoria's smile, at the crowd of people who had enabled him, who had looked away from my mother's suffering because it was easier then acknowledging what they saw, and I began to tell the truth. "My mother died believing she was loved," I said, my voice calm and clear. "She died believing that her husband had done everything possible to save her. She died believing that her illness was just fate, bad luck, something that happened to her rather than something that was done to her." The room grew quiet. My father's smile faltered. "But she was wrong," I continued, "and tonight I'm going to tell you exactly how wrong she was." I didn't rush. I didn't shout. I simply told them, fact by fact, lie by lie, exactly what I had discovered. I told them about the medical bills left unpaid while he spent thousands on hotels and gifts for his mistress. I told them about the treatments cancelled, the medications denied, the suffering prolonged because he chose convenience over care. I told them how he had been with Victoria when my mother died, how he had left her alone in her final moments because someone else had needed him more. The room was silent except for my voice. I showed them the documents I had prepared, projected on the screen behind me, impossible to ignore. Bank statements, text messages, time-stamped photos, a timeline that proved beyond any doubt the scope of his betrayal. I watched my father's face change as he realised what was happening. Confusion first, then anger, then something like fear as he understood how much I knew, how long I had been planning this, how completely I had him trapped. I watched Victoria's face as she recognised messages she thought had been deleted, conversations she thought were private, evidence of a relationship that had begun long before my mother's diagnosis. Evidence that destroyed the story she had told of innocent love blooming after tragedy. I spoke for 30 minutes. I had planned every word, rehearsed every pause, anticipated every reaction. I didn't need notes. I had lived with this information for so long that it was part of me now, as familiar as my own heartbeat. When I finished, the room was silent. Then the questions began. My father tried to laugh it off at first. "An emotional daughter," he said, still grieving, confused by her pain. He tried to charm the room the way he had always charmed rooms, with his smile and his confidence and his assumption that people would believe him because they always had. But I had anticipated this. I had sent copies of everything to key people in the room, the journalists, the board members, the partners whose investment in his company depended on his reputation for integrity. They had received packages that morning, carefully timed to arrive before the party, giving them hours to verify what I was about to reveal. They weren't confused. They weren't charmed. They were angry. Victoria tried a different approach. She stood, her voice shaking, and told a story about how my mother had pushed them together, had wanted my father to be happy, had given her blessing for their relationship. It was a beautiful story. It was also a complete fiction, and everyone in the room now had evidence proving it. She tried to leave. I had anticipated that too. At the entrance, she found reporters, not the society journalists who had been invited, but investigative reporters I had contacted, who had been working on this story for months with the information I had fed them. They had questions about financial fraud, about forged signatures on medical documents, about insurance claims that might constitute criminal behaviour. She couldn't answer. The story she had built her life on was collapsing, and beneath it was nothing but lies. My father, watching this unfold, finally lost his composure. He shouted at me across the room, calling me ungrateful, calling me delusional, demanding that I stop embarrassing him. He tried to approach me, and I simply stood still, watching him, my face calm. "You can't do this," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm your father." "You were my mother's husband," I replied quietly. That should have meant something. Security intervened before he could reach me. Not the country club security, private security I had hired, who had been briefed on exactly what might happen and who had their instructions. They escorted my father to a private room, away from the cameras and the questions and the consequences he had spent years avoiding. Victoria followed, her face streaked with mascara, her carefully constructed image destroyed. I stayed. I answered every question put to me with calm precision. Yes, I had documentation for everything, claimed. Yes, I had copies for anyone who wanted them. Yes, I understood that my father might face legal consequences. And no, I would not be recanting my statements. The party, needless to say, ended early. The investigation began within days. The insurance company that had paid out my mother's policy wanted answers about the cancelled treatments and forged signatures. The medical board wanted to understand how bills had gone unpaid despite available funds. The IRS became interested in the money my father had moved between accounts, trying to hide his spending from my mother. His company's board called an emergency meeting. His partners began distancing themselves. Investors started asking questions about his judgment, his integrity, his fitness to lead. The carefully built empire he had constructed began to crack, not from any external force, but from the weight of his own actions finally exposed. Victoria left him 3 weeks after the party, not because of morality or conscience, but because the money was gone. The lifestyle was gone. The dream of being the wife of a successful man, celebrated and envied, was replaced by the reality of being linked to a scandal. She released a statement through a lawyer claiming she had been deceived, that she had never known the full truth, that she was as much a victim as anyone. I had predicted that too. I had evidence showing exactly how much she had known and when, messages proving she had encouraged his lies, that she had actively helped him hide his spending. I gave that evidence to the reporters who had been so kind to her in the early days, who had written sympathetic stories about the woman maligned by a grieving daughter. They wrote different stories now. My father tried to fight. He hired lawyers, expensive ones, who filed motions and made arguments, and tried to paint me as a vindictive child seeking revenge. They tried to argue that I had stolen privileged information, that I had violated his privacy, that my evidence was inadmissible. But I had been so careful. Every document I possessed, I had obtained legally. Every recording I had made was in a one-party consent state. Every piece of evidence had been verified by independent experts. His lawyers found nothing to attack but the truth itself, and the truth didn't care about their objections. The civil suits came next. My mother's medical providers, seeking payment for bills left deliberately unpaid. The insurance company demanding repayment of fraudulent claims. And, finally, my own suit, claiming breach of fiduciary duty, seeking return of the funds he had controlled as trustee, demanding an accounting of every dollar he had spent from my mother's estate. He couldn't defend himself. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern was clear, and the jury, when it finally heard the case, saw exactly what I needed them to see. A man who had valued his own pleasure over his dying wife's care, who had betrayed every vow he had made, who had stolen from his own daughter to fund his affair. The judgments were substantial. More than he could pay, even selling everything he owned. His company was forced into bankruptcy. His assets were liquidated. His reputation was destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. But I didn't need his money. I had never needed his money. What I needed was for him to lose everything the way my mother had lost everything. Her health, her dignity, her belief in the man she had loved. I needed him to understand what it felt like to be erased. I saw him one final time, 6 months after the party that ended his world. He was living in a small apartment, the kind my mother would have found elegant because she had learned to find beauty in small things. He looked older, diminished, a man whose certainty had been stripped away. He asked to see me. I agreed, curious about what he might say, what justification he might offer, now that there was nothing left to protect. We sat in his sparse living room. He didn't offer coffee or small talk. He looked at me with something like recognition, as if he were finally seeing me clearly for the first time. "You planned all of this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "For how long?" "Since I was 16. He absorbed this, his face unreadable. "Your mother would have hated this." "My mother would have hated what you did to her," I replied calmly. "She died believing she wasn't worth fighting for. She died believing that love meant accepting betrayal. She died making herself smaller and smaller until she disappeared completely. That's what she would have hated. Not that I fought back, but that she never believed she could." "I loved her," he said, and I thought I heard genuine pain in his voice. "No," I said gently. "You loved the idea of being the kind of man who could love someone like her. You loved how her devotion made you feel. You loved the image of yourself as a good husband. But you didn't love her enough to choose her. Not once, when it mattered." He had no answer for that. "Did you ever actually love me?" I asked, and I was surprised to find I genuinely wanted to know. He thought about it for a long time. "I don't know," he finally said. "I think I loved the daughter I wanted you to be. I don't think I ever knew who you actually were." It was, I realised, the most honest thing he had ever said to me. "Then we're even," I told him, "because I stopped loving you the moment I understood what you were." I stood to leave. At the door, I paused. "For what it's worth," I said, "I didn't destroy you for revenge. I did it because someone needed to prove that actions have consequences, that you can't spend a lifetime hurting people and expect to walk away unscathed, that silence isn't the same as acceptance, and that patience isn't the same as weakness." "And did it help?" he asked. "Does any of this make you feel better?" I considered the question honestly. "No," I admitted. "Nothing will bring her back. Nothing will give her the life she deserved. But at least she won't be forgotten. At least her suffering meant something. At least the story that gets told about her isn't the one you would have written, the devoted wife who faded quietly away while her husband moved on to happier things. What story will be told instead?" "The truth," I said simply. "That she was betrayed by the person who promised to protect her. That she was worth more than she was given. That her daughter remembered every moment and spent years making sure the world would remember too." I left him there, in his small apartment, with nothing but his own company, and the knowledge that he had been seen, finally, for exactly what he was. I didn't attend his funeral when he died 2 years later. He had a heart attack alone in that apartment, and by the time anyone found him, he had been gone for days. There were no obituaries in the major papers, no tributes from colleagues or partners, no crowds of mourners celebrating his life and legacy. Victoria didn't attend either. She had moved to another city, changed her name, tried to start over somewhere people didn't know her story. I didn't follow her. She had been a symptom of his sickness, not its cause, and she had already paid the price of her choices. I went to my mother's grave instead the day of his funeral. I brought white lilies, real ones, not the artificial arrangements that had surrounded her casket. I sat beside her headstone and told her everything I had done, every step of the plan she never knew I was building, every moment of the justice she never asked for but deserved. I told her about the moment at the party when I had finally spoken the truth she had never been allowed to speak. I told her about the look on his face when he realized he had underestimated me, that the daughter he had dismissed as too emotional and too weak had been the architect of his downfall all along. I told her that I had won. Not because I had destroyed him, though I had. Not because I had reclaimed the money he had stolen, though I had done that too. But because I had transformed my pain into something stronger than his lies. Because I had refused to be erased the way he had erased her. Because I had taken every lesson he taught me about manipulation and power and used them against him with a precision he never saw coming. The sun was setting by the time I finished talking. The graveyard was empty, silent except for the wind moving through the trees. I stood, brushing dirt from my knees, and placed my hand on her headstone. "I didn't do it for revenge, Mum," I said quietly. "I did it because you taught me I was worth more than silence. Because you told me I was stronger than you. Because someone needed to prove that people like him don't get to win just because their victims are too tired, or too kind, or too destroyed to fight back." I left the flowers there and walked away, toward the car I had bought with my inheritance. The inheritance I had fought 3 years to reclaim, that he had tried to keep from me until the courts forced him to surrender it. I had invested it carefully, built something stable and strong, created a life that was entirely my own. I had started a foundation in my mother's name, funding cancer treatment for families who couldn't afford it, paying the bills that insurance wouldn't cover, making sure that no one had to choose between their health and their dignity the way she had. I had named it after her, making sure her name would be remembered for something more than being the woman who had been betrayed. I had built a life she would have been proud of, not because I had destroyed my father. She would have mourned that, I think, because she had loved him despite everything, but because I had refused to let her suffering be meaningless, because I had transformed victimhood into agency, pain into purpose, silence into truth. Years have passed now. I'm no longer the angry girl who slammed doors, or the calculating woman who built a case file instead of processing grief. I've learnt to carry my mother's memory without letting it consume me, to honour her without defining myself by her pain. Sometimes people ask me if I regret what I did, if I wish I had forgiven him, moved on, chosen peace over justice. They tell me that revenge never truly satisfies, that I probably feel empty now, that I should have been the bigger person. I smile when they say this, the same smile I gave my father across that mahogany table. The smile that hides everything I know they'll never understand. I don't regret a single moment, because I didn't seek revenge. Revenge is about making someone hurt the way you hurt, about inflicting pain to balance some cosmic scale. What I did was simpler and more profound. I held him accountable. I made sure that his actions had consequences. I refused to let him rewrite history, to erase my mother's suffering, to pretend that love and loyalty meant anything when they came from him. I didn't destroy him. He destroyed himself through years of choices he made freely, through betrayals he committed willingly, through a life built on lies that could only stand as long as no one looked too closely. All I did was turn on the lights. My victory was never about his downfall. It was about refusing to be diminished by his lies. It was about building myself into someone who couldn't be broken by betrayal, or silenced by expectation, or defeated by the assumption that young women are too emotional to be dangerous. I learned something crucial in those years of planning. Power doesn't come from being loud or aggressive or demanding attention. Real power comes from being underestimated, from using people's assumptions against them, from building strength in the shadows while they're too busy congratulating themselves to notice. I learned that patience is a weapon, that silence can be a strategy, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is to avenge them, even if they never asked for it, even if they would have chosen differently. Most importantly, I learned that I could transform myself into exactly what I needed to be. Not for him, not to meet anyone else's expectations, but for me. For the girl who stood outside a bathroom door listening to her mother cry. For the teenager who catalogued lies in a hidden notebook. For the woman who stood at a microphone and told the truth no matter the cost. I didn't destroy him. I outgrew him. I outgrew the need for his approval, his love, his presence in my life. I outgrew the role of the victim, the grieving daughter, the powerless child. I outgrew the belief that family loyalty meant accepting betrayal, that love meant silence, that being a good person meant letting bad people win. My mother told me I would be stronger than her. She was right, but not in the way she imagined. My strength wasn't in enduring what she endured, in suffering silently, in making myself small enough to avoid conflict. My strength was in refusing to accept that her pain was inevitable, that her betrayal was just something that happened, that her erasure was the price of peace. My strength was in remembering when the world wanted to forget, in speaking when silence would have been easier, in building, brick by brick, word by word, document by document, a truth that couldn't be denied. Now when I visit her grave, I don't apologize for what I did. I don't ask for forgiveness or understanding. I simply tell her what I've built, the lives I've helped, the good that's come from the pain she endured. I tell her about the woman I've become, not in reaction to him, but in honor of her. I tell her that I'm free from the weight of pretending, from the performance of being what others expected, from the exhausting work of maintaining relationships built on lies, free from the fear that I might become like her, too kind, too accommodating, too willing to sacrifice myself for people who didn't deserve the sacrifice. I tell her that her suffering wasn't wasted, that her quiet strength, her dignity, her grace even in betrayal, those things live in me, but transformed into something sharper, something that cuts through lies instead of swallowing them. And I tell her every time that I didn't do any of this for revenge. I did it because she deserved better, because I deserved better, because silence is not strength, and acceptance is not peace. And sometimes the only way to honor someone's memory is to refuse to let the story end the way their betrayer would have written it. My father's legacy is bankruptcy and exposure and the knowledge that he died alone because no one who truly knew him could bear to stay. Victoria's legacy is a cautionary tale about choosing ambition over integrity, about building a life on someone else's suffering. But my mother's legacy? Her legacy is in the lives saved by her foundation, in the families who receive treatment they couldn't afford, in the patients who don't have to choose between dignity and survival. Her legacy is in the daughter who learned that love doesn't mean accepting betrayal, that kindness doesn't mean being weak, that being good doesn't mean letting bad people win. Her legacy is me, not as I was, angry and helpless and screaming into the void, but as I became through years of patience and planning and careful transformation. A woman who knows her worth, a woman who refuses to be erased, a woman who understands that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to let the truth die with the victim. I am my mother's daughter, but I am not my mother. I am what she could have been if someone had taught her that her pain mattered, that her life had value beyond what she could give to others, that love without respect is just another word for exploitation. I am the woman she wished she could be, the woman she raised me to become, even if she never quite believed it was possible. And that's not his destruction, not the money reclaimed, not the reputation rebuilt. That is my victory. I didn't destroy him. I became untouchable. And in a world that tried to teach me that women exist to be diminished, that daughters inherit their mother's suffering, that silence is the price of survival, that's everything.